She was maybe 6 years old, running as fast as her legs could carry her, tears streaming down her face, and she ran straight into a bar full of bikers. What happened next left an entire street speechless. The Iron Wolves had been parked outside Mercer's Tavern since 4 in the afternoon. It was a Saturday in early October, one of those last warm days before the season turns completely, when the air still holds a little summer but the light already has that lower golden angle that tells you things are changing. There were 11 of them that day, a mix of the older founding members and a few of the younger riders who had earned their cuts over the past several years. Their motorcycles were lined up along the curb outside, a row of chrome and black that caught the afternoon light in long horizontal flashes. Inside, the mood was exactly what it always was on a Saturday. Unhurried. Comfortable. The particular ease of people who had known each other long enough that silence between sentences was as welcome as the sentences themselves. Boris, the oldest and largest of them, was at his usual spot at the end of the bar, a glass of water in front of him because he had stopped drinking 7 years ago and nobody made anything of it anymore. Kostya was at the table near the window, talking to 2 of the younger members about something involving a carburetor. The television above the bar was showing a football match that nobody was quite watching. The door opened hard. Not the way doors open when someone is in a hurry. The way doors open when someone small is pushing with everything they have. She was 6 years old, maybe 7. Dark hair loose and tangled around her face, a yellow jacket with one pocket torn at the seam, shoes that lit up at the heel with each step. She had been crying long enough that her whole face was red and wet, and she was still crying, the breathless kind that happens when a child has been running and sobbing at the same time and the body cannot quite manage both but keeps trying. She stood in the doorway of the bar and looked at the room full of large men in leather, and she did not hesitate for even 1 second. She ran to Boris. Not because she knew him. Not because he looked approachable, because by any objective measure Boris did not look approachable. He was a large man with a long grey beard and hands the size of dinner plates and a leather cut covered in 30 years of patches. But she ran to him the way children sometimes run toward the largest solid thing in a room when everything else feels like it is falling. She grabbed the sleeve of his jacket with both hands and looked up at him with her red wet face and said, with the particular clarity of a child communicating something urgent, "They are beating my mama. Please come. Please." The bar went completely quiet. Boris was off his stool before she finished the sentence. He was not a fast-moving man in ordinary circumstances. In that moment he moved with a speed that did not match his size at all. He crouched down to her level, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders, and asked her where. She pointed toward the door. She said the building next to the laundromat. She said there were 2 of them and her mama had told her to run and get help. Boris stood up. He looked at the room. Nobody needed to be asked. Kostya was already at the door. The 2 younger members at the table were right behind him. The others followed in the particular quiet way that men move when the situation has already been understood and there is no need for discussion. Within 45 seconds of the little girl walking through the door, 9 members of the Iron Wolves were on the street moving toward the building she had pointed to. Boris stayed with the girl, one hand resting gently on her shoulder, and told her to stay right there and that everything was going to be all right. She looked up at him with those red eyes and asked if he promised. Boris, who was not a man who made promises easily, said yes. He promised. The building next to the laundromat was a 3-story residential block, the kind that had been built in the 70s and maintained just enough to remain standing. The door to the ground floor unit was not fully closed. Voices were coming from inside, loud ones, the kind that carry through walls and doors and leave no doubt about what is happening. Kostya went in first. The others followed. What they found was a woman, perhaps 30, dark hair, one side of her face already showing the damage of the last several minutes. She was backed against the kitchen counter with her arms partially raised in the instinctive way of someone trying to protect themselves without enough to work with. 2 men, both younger, one considerably larger, had positioned themselves between her and the door. The 2 men turned when the Iron Wolves came through the door. 9 large men in leather cuts standing in a small kitchen doorway produce a very specific effect on a room. The effect is immediate and it is total. The larger of the 2 men said something that began as a threat and ended as nothing because the sentence lost its confidence somewhere in the middle and simply stopped. Kostya looked at the woman and asked if she was all right. She said she was. He asked if these men had been hurting her. She looked at the 2 men and then at the 9 bikers filling her doorway and she said yes. Kostya turned to the 2 men. He did not raise his voice. He did not make any movement that could be described as threatening. He simply told them, with the quiet certainty of someone who has never needed volume to be believed, that they were going to leave this apartment, they were going to leave this building, and they were going to keep going until this address was something they thought about as little as possible. He said this was the only conversation they were going to have on the subject. The 2 men left. Quickly. Without collecting anything from the apartment. Without saying anything further. The kind of leaving that happens when a decision has been made completely for you. When Kostya came back outside, Boris was still standing on the pavement with the little girl, who had her hand wrapped around 2 of his large fingers. When she saw her mother come through the building door with the others, she let go of Boris and ran. Her mother caught her and held her in the way mothers hold children after fear has passed, pressing her close, her chin resting on the top of the little girl's head, eyes closed. The Iron Wolves stood on the pavement and gave them that moment. After a while, the woman looked up at the men standing there in the late afternoon light, and she did not seem to know what to say. Boris told her she did not need to say anything. He asked if she had somewhere safe to go that evening, family, or a friend. She said her sister lived across the city. Boris told Kostya, who made a phone call, and within 20 minutes one of the younger members who had not come to the scene arrived with his car and drove her and her daughter across the city himself. Before they left, the little girl came back to Boris. She stood in front of him and looked up and said thank you. Then she reached into the torn pocket of her yellow jacket and pulled out a small plastic figure, a horse, white with a painted menere, the kind that comes in a set and is carried in a pocket because it is a favorite. She held it out to him. Boris looked at the small plastic horse in her small open hand. He looked at her face. He took it with the kind of care you take with something that matters. He told her she was the bravest person he had met in a long time. He said that running toward help when everything is frightening was one of the hardest things a person could do, and she had done it without hesitating. She considered this seriously, the way children consider things when they know they are being spoken to honestly. Then she got into the car. Boris watched the car until it turned the corner. Then he stood on the pavement for a moment with the small white plastic horse in his large weathered hand. Nobody said anything. The motorcycles were still lined up at the curb, chrome catching the last of the afternoon light. The street was quiet. The day had turned into something none of them had expected when they parked there at 4 o'clock. Kostya came and stood beside Boris and looked at the horse. He said, after a moment, that they should probably go back inside. Boris said yes. He put the horse carefully in the front pocket of his cut, in the same place he kept things he intended to keep. They went back inside. The football match was still playing above the bar. Nobody was watching it. Some calls for help do not come through phones or emergency lines. Some of them come through a door held open by the weight of a small determined body, from someone too young to know that the room she ran into was supposed to be intimidating, and too desperate to care. She just ran toward the largest solid thing she could see and trusted it to hold. That is not a small thing. That is everything. A child's trust is the most serious weight a person can be given. The Iron Wolves understood that. They were in motion before the sentence was finished. That is the only right answer when a child looks up at you and says please. If you are ever the largest solid thing in someone's moment of fear, be worthy of it. You may be the only door they knew to run through.